The Royal Palace was one of the most visited tourist spots in the city. It stood tall, its golden gates shining under the bright sunlight. Crowds of visitors walked around, taking pictures and admiring the beautiful architecture. But the main attraction for many wasn't just the palace, it was the royal guards. The guards, dressed in their sharp uniforms with shiny buttons and tall hats, stood like statues in front of the gates. Their faces were expressionless, and they didn't move a muscle. To most people, their stillness and discipline were fascinating. People admired how they could stand perfectly still for hours, no matter what happened around them. For some tourists, though, the guards were a challenge, a way to test how far they could go. People would wave their hands in front of the guards' faces, make silly faces, or even try to make them laugh. Most visitors did this playfully and stopped when they realized the guards wouldn't react. But there was always someone who took things too far. Among the tourists that day was a man named Jake. He was tall and confident, wearing sunglasses and a flashy shirt. Jake was the kind of person who liked being the center of attention. He always looked for ways to stand out in a crowd, even if it meant being a little rude. Jake was traveling with his group of friends, and they were just as loud and carefree as him. As they walked past the guards, Jake's eyes lit up. He saw the guards as an opportunity for a little fun. "Look at them," Jake said to his friends, grinning. "They're like robots. I bet I can get one of them to move." His friends laughed, encouraging him. "You can't. They're trained for this," one of them replied. But Jake wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. Nearby, a trash bin stood with some empty soda cans inside. Jake grabbed one of the cans and held it up, showing it to his friends. "Watch this," he said, his grin widening. As Jake walked closer to one of the guards, the tourists around noticed him. Some people started whispering, wondering what he was going to do. A few took out their phones, ready to record whatever was about to happen. Jake stopped right in front of the guard. The guard, like always, didn't move. His eyes stared straight ahead, focused and calm. Jake waved the soda can in front of the guard's face, but there was no reaction. Then, with a dramatic gesture, Jake tilted the can and let it drop onto the guard's pristine uniform. The shiny soda can bounced off the guard's chest and landed on the ground with a small clang. A gasp came from the crowd. Some people looked shocked, others annoyed. But Jake just turned to his friends, laughing. "See? Nothing. They're like statues," Jake said, raising his arms as if he'd won some kind of game. His friends laughed with him, but the rest of the crowd wasn't amused. The guard, however, didn't even blink. He stood as still as ever, his face calm and unreadable. But while Jake was busy laughing, he didn't notice the small movement the guard made, a subtle press of a button on his uniform. Jake had no idea that the royal guards didn't need to speak to respond, and he certainly didn't realize that this moment would change his life forever. Jake walked away from the guard with a smug look on his face. He acted like he had just won a contest, but in reality, he had no idea what he'd just done. His friends were laughing and cheering him on, giving him high fives. Jake loved the attention. He thrived on being the guy who could make people laugh, even if it meant going a little too far. "Did you see his face?" Jake said, though the guard hadn't reacted at all. "Completely frozen. These guys are like statues. It's so weird." The group of friends kept walking through the palace grounds, pointing at different things and cracking jokes. Jake felt like a star. Some other tourists, though, didn't share his enthusiasm. A woman with her 2 young kids frowned as Jake passed by. She whispered something to her husband, who shook his head disapprovingly. "That guy's going to regret it," the man murmured under his breath. Unbeknownst to Jake, the guard he had mocked had already reported the incident. The small button the guard pressed was a silent alarm that notified the palace security team. In the control room, security staff watched Jake's actions through the surveillance cameras. They had seen everything: the soda can, the mocking behavior, and Jake's loud exit. The palace had strict rules about disrespecting the guards. The guards represented more than just security. They were a symbol of honor, tradition, and discipline. Visitors who crossed the line weren't just disrespecting the guards, but also the history and culture they stood for. Jake had crossed that line, and now the palace security team was tracking him. Meanwhile, Jake and his friends stopped at a small cafe near the palace. They ordered snacks and drinks, still laughing about the stunt. Jake leaned back in his chair, feeling completely at ease. "I bet that guard's still standing there, pretending like nothing happened," he said with a chuckle. His friends laughed along, but one of them, a guy named Liam, looked a little uneasy. "I don't know, man. Maybe we went too far," Liam said, glancing back toward the palace. Jake waved him off. "Relax. These guys are trained for this. It's their job to stay calm no matter what. Besides, it's not like I hurt anyone." But Liam wasn't convinced. He noticed that some other tourists were giving their table odd looks. A few of them had seen Jake's stunt and didn't seem to find it funny. Just as Jake was about to brush it off again, two men in sharp uniforms walked into the cafe. They weren't just ordinary palace guards. They were royal security officers. Their presence immediately commanded attention. The entire cafe fell silent as they scanned the room, their eyes landing on Jake. One of the officers stepped forward and addressed Jake in a firm, calm voice. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Jake froze. For the first time that day, his cocky confidence wavered. His friends exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. Is there a problem?" Jake asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice betrayed his nervousness. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured toward the door. "We'll explain everything outside," he said. Jake's stomach churned as he got up from his chair. The laughter was gone now, replaced by a heavy silence. Tourists in the cafe whispered among themselves, some even pulling out their phones to record the scene. As Jake followed the officers out of the cafe, he couldn't shake the faith. Jake followed the officers out of the cafe, his heart pounding harder with every step. His friends trailed behind, exchanging nervous whispers. The once confident Jake was now visibly uneasy. The two royal security officers led him to a quiet area near the palace gates, away from the bustling crowd. "What's going on?" Jake asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice cracked slightly. "I didn't do anything wrong." The taller officer, who seemed to be in charge, turned to face him. His expression was calm but serious. "Sir, we witnessed your actions against one of the royal guards earlier," he said in a firm tone. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Jake blinked, confused. "What? I didn't hurt anyone. It was just a joke," he said defensively, his voice rising a little. The second officer, shorter but equally imposing, stepped forward. "That joke, as you call it, was an act of disrespect toward a member of the royal guard. These guards are not here for your amusement. They represent centuries of tradition, discipline, and service to the crown." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but the officer wasn't finished. "When you dumped trash on that guard, you didn't just disrespect him. You disrespected everything he stands for. And that is not something we take lightly." The words hit Jake harder than he expected. For the first time, he started to feel the weight of what he'd done. The crowd of tourists at the gates had noticed the scene unfolding and began to gather nearby. Some whispered to each other, while others pulled out their phones to record what was happening. Jake shifted uncomfortably under the growing attention. "Look, I didn't mean to offend anyone," he said, his tone softer now. "It was just a stupid prank. I didn't think it was a big deal." The taller officer's eyes narrowed. "That's exactly the problem. You didn't think. Actions have consequences, Mr. Jake," he muttered. "Mr. Jake," the officer continued, "we will not be letting this incident slide. This is a royal institution, and behavior like yours sets a poor example for everyone watching. However, instead of pressing formal charges, we are giving you an opportunity to learn from this." Learn? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer nodded. You will be escorted back to the palace gates, where you will publicly apologize to the guard and the visitors who witnessed your behavior. Jake's eyes widened. What? Apologize? In front of everyone? Yes, the officer said firmly. Your actions were public, so your apology must be public too. This is your chance to take responsibility for your behavior and show respect. Jake's stomach churned at the thought of standing in front of all those people and admitting he was wrong. But he also knew he didn't have much of a choice. He glanced at his friends, who looked equally uncomfortable but said nothing to help him. The officer's voice softened slightly. This is not about embarrassing you, Jake. It's about teaching you and others that respect matters. Do you understand? Jake swallowed hard and nodded. Yeah, I understand, he mumbled. Good, the officer said. Follow us. As they walked back toward the palace gates, Jake couldn't help but feel the eyes of the crowd on him. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced. This wasn't how he'd expected his day to go, but deep down, he knew he had to face the consequences of his actions. When they reached the gates, Jake took a deep breath. The officer gave him a nod, and Jake stepped forward, ready to make things right. Jake stood at the palace gates, his nerves getting the better of him as the growing crowd watched. Tourists, palace visitors, and even a few locals had gathered to see what was happening. Some had their phones out, recording every moment. Jake felt like all eyes were drilling into him, and for once in his life, he didn't enjoy being the center of attention. The tall officer gestured toward a small platform near the gate. It wasn't much, just a slightly elevated area used for announcements. But at that moment, it felt like a stage where Jake was about to give the most uncomfortable performance of his life. Step up, Mr. Jake, the officer said firmly but not unkindly. Jake hesitated, looking over at his friends. They stood off to the side, their faces a mix of sympathy and embarrassment. None of them dared to speak up or offer any advice. With a deep breath, Jake climbed onto the platform. His hands felt clammy, and his heart pounded like a drum. Speak clearly, the shorter officer said. Apologize for your actions and show respect. Jake nodded, his mouth dry as he turned to face the crowd. The tourists stared back, some with judgment in their eyes, others looking curious. And then, standing at attention near the gate, was the royal guard he had disrespected earlier. The guard stood as still as ever, his face calm and unreadable. Jake couldn't even tell if the man was angry or indifferent. That made it even worse. Jake cleared his throat. His voice came out shaky at first, but he forced himself to continue. I just want to say, I'm sorry. The crowd remained silent, waiting for more. Jake could feel the weight of their expectations, and he knew a half-hearted apology wouldn't be enough. He took another breath, his voice steadier now. Earlier today, I disrespected one of the royal guards. I thought it was just a joke, but now I realize it was wrong. The guards here represent something much bigger than just standing still. They're a symbol of tradition and respect for this country, and I didn't show them the respect they deserve. The crowd murmured softly. Some nodded in approval, while others still seemed skeptical. Jake glanced at the guard again, hoping to see some kind of reaction, but the man remained motionless. I understand now that my actions had consequences, Jake continued. Not just for me, but for the people who saw what I did. I set a bad example, and I regret it. To the guard I disrespected, and to everyone here, I sincerely apologize. Jake's voice faltered at the end, but he meant every word. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to be funny or get attention. He was just being honest. The taller officer stepped forward and nodded. Thank you, Mr. Jake. We accept your apology. The crowd began to clap, some lightly, others more enthusiastically. Jake felt a small wave of relief, though he knew this wasn't over yet. The officer leaned in and whispered, "There's still one more step." Jake blinked. One more step. The officer gestured toward the guard. You're going to apologize to him personally. Jake swallowed hard, but he nodded. As he stepped down from the platform and approached the guard, the crowd watched in anticipation. The moment felt heavier than he'd imagined, but Jake knew it was necessary. He stopped in front of the guard, looking him in the eye. I'm sorry for what I did, Jake said quietly but sincerely. I disrespected you, and I shouldn't have. The guard didn't respond, at least not at first. Then, to Jake's surprise, the guard gave the smallest of nods. It was barely noticeable, but it was enough. Jake stepped back, feeling both humbled and strangely at peace. He had learned a lesson he wouldn't forget anytime soon. After Jake's public apology, the crowd began to disperse. Some tourists lingered, still murmuring about the unusual scene they had just witnessed. Jake, on the other hand, felt a mix of relief and lingering embarrassment. He thought it was all over, but then the taller officer approached him again. Before you leave, there's something you need to understand, the officer said, his voice calm but firm. We'd like you to hear directly from the guard you disrespected. Jake blinked in surprise. The guard? But he doesn't talk, right? I mean, they're not allowed to. The officer's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. They don't speak while on duty, yes. But now that his shift is over, he's free to talk. Follow me. Jake hesitated but nodded, curiosity tugging at him. He followed the officer into a quieter part of the palace grounds, where the guard from earlier stood waiting. Out of uniform, he looked less intimidating, though he still carried an air of quiet dignity. His name tag read Daniel. Daniel looked at Jake, his expression calm but serious. Jake felt a knot of guilt tighten in his chest. This was the man he had mocked and disrespected earlier, and now he had to face him. I'm Daniel, the guard said, his voice deep but steady. I've been a royal guard for 8 years. Jake nodded awkwardly. Hi, I'm Jake. I guess you already know that. Daniel didn't laugh or smile. Instead, he continued, I'm glad you apologized out there. But I want you to understand why what you did matters. Being a royal guard isn't just a job for me. It's a duty. I stand here every day, not for myself, but for what I represent. Jake nodded again, feeling small under Daniel's steady gaze. I didn't think about it like that, he admitted. I thought it was just, I don't know, something funny. Daniel's expression softened slightly. A lot of people think that. They see us as part of the scenery, something to joke about. But they don't see the years of training we go through, the discipline it takes to stand here, rain or shine, no matter what's happening around us. Jake listened intently, the weight of Daniel's words sinking in. He realized how little he had understood about the guards and their role. I've had people yell at me, throw things at me, even try to push me, Daniel continued. But I don't move because that's my duty. It's not easy, but I'm proud of it. And when someone disrespects that, it's not just about me. It's about the values I stand for. Jake swallowed hard. I'm sorry, he said again, his voice quiet but sincere. I didn't think about any of that. I was just trying to make my friends laugh, but it wasn't worth it. Daniel nodded, his gaze softening further. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. I hope you'll take this as a lesson, not just for yourself, but for others. People like me don't stand here for applause or recognition. We stand here because we believe in something bigger than ourselves. Jake felt a wave of respect wash over him. He had never thought much about duty or sacrifice before, but now, standing in front of Daniel, he understood. Thank you, Jake said, his voice steady. For everything. Daniel gave him a small nod, and for the first time, Jake noticed the hint of a smile on the guard's face. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let Jake know that his apology had been accepted. As Jake walked away, he felt different, humbled, wiser, and determined to never take another person's role or dedication for granted again. After Jake's conversation with Daniel, he thought it was all over, but he was wrong. The taller officer approached him again and said, "Now comes the part where you make it right. Not just with the guard, but with everyone who saw what you did." Jake's stomach tightened. "You mean I have to do something else?" The officer nodded. "Yes. You need to make a public apology in front of the visitors at the palace. They saw you disrespect the guard, so they need to see you take responsibility for it." Jake's heart sank. The thought of standing in front of a crowd and admitting his mistake made him feel exposed. But deep down, he knew this was necessary. He had caused a scene, and now he had to own up to it. The officers led Jake back to the palace gates, where a small crowd had already gathered. Word had spread about the earlier incident, and people were curious to see what would happen next. Jake's friends stood nearby, looking nervous and unsure of what to say. Some of the tourists had their phones out, ready to record. Jake took a deep breath as the officer gestured for him to step forward. "Remember," the officer said, his tone firm but encouraging. "Speak from the heart. Be honest, and take responsibility." Jake nodded, his palms sweaty as he faced the crowd. He could feel their eyes on him, some judgmental, others curious. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "Hi, everyone," Jake said, his voice shaky at first. "My name is Jake, and earlier today, I did something really disrespectful. I threw trash on one of the royal guards and treated him like a joke. At the time, I thought it was funny, but now I see how wrong I was." The crowd was silent, listening intently. Jake could feel his nerves easing a little as he continued. "The guards here aren't just standing around for no reason. They represent something bigger. Tradition, respect, and discipline. I didn't think about that before, but now I understand how important their role is. What I did wasn't just disrespectful to the guard. It was disrespectful to everything he stands for." Jake glanced at the guard he had disrespected earlier, still standing at attention near the gate. His expression remained calm and unreadable, but Jake felt a flicker of hope that his words were making an impact. "I want to apologize to the guard, to the palace, and to everyone who saw what I did," Jake said, his voice growing steadier. "I know I can't take back what happened, but I hope this apology shows that I've learned my lesson. I'll never do something like this again, and I'll make sure to tell others to respect the people who dedicate themselves to roles like this." There was a pause as Jake finished speaking, and then, to his surprise, the crowd began to clap. It wasn't a thunderous applause, but it was enough to let Jake know that his words had been received. The taller officer stepped forward and gave Jake a nod. "Well said, Mr. Jake. Now, if you'll follow me, we'll wrap this up." Jake followed the officer to the guard he had mocked earlier. Standing face to face with him again, Jake felt a surge of humility. He extended his hand and said, "I'm sorry for what I did. I hope you can forgive me." The guard didn't shake Jake's hand, but he gave him a slight nod. It was a small gesture, but it carried a lot of meaning. Jake felt a weight lift off his shoulders. As he walked away from the palace, Jake felt a mix of embarrassment and relief. He had made a mistake, but he had also taken responsibility for it. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had learned something important. Jake thought the worst was over as he walked away from the palace gates. He had apologized to the guard, spoken to the crowd, and faced the officers. But what Jake didn't realize was that his actions, and his apology, were now part of a much bigger conversation. Unbeknownst to him, several tourists had recorded everything that had happened, from the moment he disrespected the guard to his heartfelt apology. Videos were quickly uploaded to social media, gaining attention faster than Jake could have imagined. The captions varied, but many criticized his initial behavior. One video read, "Tourist disrespects royal guard. What happens next will shock you." Another said, "A lesson in respect. Watch this tourist learn the hard way." As Jake walked back to his hotel with his friends, his phone buzzed with notifications. He ignored it at first, thinking it was just messages from his group chat. But then Liam, one of his friends, tapped him on the shoulder. Jake, you're kind of blowing up online. Liam said, showing him a video on his phone. Jake stared at the screen in disbelief. It was a clip of him dumping the soda can on the guard, followed by the officers confronting him and his public apology. The video had already been viewed thousands of times, with comments flooding in by the second. How did this happen so fast? Jake muttered, feeling a knot of anxiety in his stomach. His friends crowded around, scrolling through the comments. Some were harsh, calling him names and criticizing his behavior. This guy has no respect for tradition. Glad he got called out. What kind of person thinks this is okay? Props to the guards for handling it so professionally. But not all the comments were negative. Many people appreciated Jake's willingness to own up to his mistake. At least he apologized. That takes guts. We've all done dumb things. He admitted he was wrong, and that's what matters. Jake's face burned as he read the mix of reactions. Part of him wanted to defend himself, to explain that it was just a stupid prank. But another part of him realized that people were right to call him out. What he had done wasn't just a harmless joke. It had real consequences. I guess I deserve this, Jake said quietly, putting his phone away. Liam gave him a reassuring pat on the back. Hey man, you messed up, but you also did the right thing in the end. Not everyone would have apologized like you did. Jake nodded, though he still felt overwhelmed. He couldn't stop thinking about the guard, Daniel, and the calm dignity he had shown throughout the whole ordeal. Jake realized that Daniel's silence had said more than any angry words ever could. By the time they reached the hotel, Jake had made a decision. He opened his phone and posted a message on his social media accounts. Today, I did something I'm not proud of. I disrespected someone who represents discipline and tradition. It was a stupid mistake, and I'm sorry for it. I've learned a lot from this experience, and I hope others can learn from it too. Respect matters. The post quickly gained traction, with many people commenting their support. Some still criticized him, but others appreciated his honesty. Jake knew that the internet's memory could be harsh, but he also knew that this experience had changed him. He wasn't the same cocky tourist who had arrived at the palace that morning. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he had grown as a person, and he hoped his story would remind others to think before they act. The next morning, Jake woke up to find his phone buzzing nonstop. His apology post from the night before had gone viral. It had been shared thousands of times, with people from all over the world commenting. Some praised him for owning up to his mistake, while others were less forgiving. The mix of feedback was overwhelming, but Jake knew it was all part of the lesson he had to learn. As he scrolled through the comments, one message stood out. It wasn't from a stranger, but from Daniel, the royal guard he had disrespected. Jake's eyes widened as he read the short yet meaningful reply. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. I hope this experience stays with you. Respect is earned, and today, you took a step toward earning it. The words hit Jake harder than he expected. He had spent the last day feeling embarrassed and judged, but Daniel's comment reminded him that growth wasn't about perfection. It was about learning from mistakes. Later that day, Jake decided to visit the palace again. Not to relive his humiliation, but to properly thank Daniel and show his appreciation for what the guards represented. His friends, who had been supportive despite everything, joined him. At the palace gates, Jake approached one of the officers who had confronted him the day before. The officer recognized him and raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised to see him again. "Back so soon?" the officer asked. Jake nodded, his voice steady. "I wanted to thank the guard I disrespected, Daniel. I don't expect to meet him again, but if you could pass along my gratitude, I'd appreciate it." The officer studied Jake for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Wait here." A few minutes later, Daniel appeared, still in uniform. His calm expression hadn't changed, but there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes. Jake stepped forward, feeling nervous but determined. "I just wanted to say thank you," Jake began. "Not just for yesterday, but for what you do every day. I didn't understand it before, but now I do. The way you handled everything. Not reacting, staying calm. It taught me more than any lecture ever could. So, thank you." Daniel gave him a long look before replying. "You've already apologized. That's enough. But if this experience has changed how you see things, then it's worth something." Jake nodded. "It has. I promise I'll do better, not just for myself, but so others can see that respect matters." Daniel's lips twitched into the faintest smile. "Good. That's all anyone can ask." Jake left the palace feeling lighter. As they walked back through the city, his friends teased him about becoming a changed man, but Jake didn't mind. He knew they were right. He wasn't the same person who had thoughtlessly thrown a soda can on a guard for a laugh. He was someone who had faced his mistake, taken responsibility, and learned from it. In the weeks that followed, Jake's story continued to spread online. People shared it as an example of how even a bad decision could lead to growth if handled the right way. Jake received messages from strangers thanking him for his honesty, and even from a few people who admitted they'd once made similar mistakes. Jake didn't shy away from these conversations. Instead, he used them as an opportunity to encourage others to think twice before acting, and to always show respect, whether it was to a royal guard or anyone else. And though the experience had started as one of the most embarrassing moments of his life, it ended as one of the most valuable lessons he'd ever learned. Jake knew he'd never forget it, and he hoped the world wouldn't either.